You better pay attention to what we have to say, because your life might well depend on whether or not you were affected by this and whether or not you're going to get cancer or a kidney problem or liver dysfunction or have a child with a birth defect. It was the defoliant. It's called Agent Orange.
It now seems possible that at least as many veterans and their children may die or suffer deformities as were killed or wounded during the war as a result of a chemical herbicide used in Vietnam. It is Agent Orange and contains a poison called dioxin, which is 1,000 times more destructive than thalidomide. Britain still permits the use of this poison as a weed killer. Almost 11 million gallons of it were dumped on Vietnam. This is Cu Chi near Saigon, which I remember as thick forest. Today it's a wilderness with the soil and water poisoned for generations. The spraying was called Operation Hades, and when the first birth deformities appeared, all they did was change the name to Operation Ranch Hand, and the spraying continued. These terribly deformed children were filmed in 1979 by director Michael Beckham and a World in Action team. It was the seeds of this unique horror that the GIs brought home with them. Most of the Agent Orange was made here in Michigan by the Dow Chemical Company, best known for napalm. The company is being sued for billions of dollars compensation by veterans. And although the company says the onus is on the veterans to prove their case, it has brought its own lawsuit against the US government, claiming that the Pentagon failed to protect its soldiers against the effects of the chemical.
That's what I looked like when I had hair before cancer. In April, it'll be 2 years that they gave me 2 to 5 years to live. And you know, I eventually end up paralyzed and blind. And they projected neurological regression till death.
Charlie Hartz was a soldier exposed to Agent Orange. Charlie's imminent death is certain. His 4 children were all born with birth defects.
Is there likely to be another Vietnam?
Could it happen to this country again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You ask Americans today, what defines our foreign policy? When is it that we're going to draw the line? And you're going to get a different response from everybody you talk to. If we don't know where we're going, is it any wonder that our allies, as well as our potential adversaries, are confused and with their confusion nervous?
This book is a collection of New York Times front pages which trace the American involvement in Vietnam, and reading it now is an eerie experience. The same headlines are appearing today, the same jargon such as escalation and light at the end of the tunnel, the same delusions. Delete Vietnam and write in El Salvador, and the stories seem almost identical. Like the politicians then, Kennedy, Johnson and Nixon, the politicians now, Haig and Reagan, see the world in the same arrogant, simplistic terms, speaking of dominoes as if nations are mere blocks of wood, not societies riven with their own differences and animosities. Today, as before, honest men pay with their careers. The American ambassador to El Salvador, Robert White, has said that the war in that country is caused by social injustice, and the real terrorists are the regime backed by Mr. Reagan and Mr. Haig, and supported, of course, by the British government.
The security forces in El Salvador have been responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of young people, and they've executed them just on the mere suspicion that they are leftists or sympathize with leftists. Are we really going to send military advisors in there to be part of that type of machinery?
For speaking that truth, the ambassador was sacked. Here is an announcement of US advisors going to Vietnam and of US troops going to protect them. The advisors have already arrived in El Salvador. As in Vietnam, the people who are dying in the streets and jungles of El Salvador are nameless stick figures on the television news or between the commercials in a rerun Hollywood movie. The American veterans of Vietnam have much in common with them, for they too have been declared expendable. Here in El Salvador, that fabled line is being drawn again to keep out forces which mysteriously threaten the most powerful nation on earth. Or from the point of view of the people of Central America, there is a feeling that change at last is possible after years of looted economies and American-backed tyrannies. For the US advisors, this might as well be dear old Saigon. As it was in Vietnam at the beginning, the advisors are to shoot back only to protect themselves. But then it's likely that US troops will go in to protect them and to prop up a hated government as it was in Vietnam. Mr. Reagan and Mr. Haig say Moscow is fueling international terrorism, but a report by even the CIA says that is nonsense. The Russians, after all, have their very own Vietnam in Afghanistan, where napalm and gunships and other horrors developed in Vietnam are being studiously copied. And that's yet another brutal irony. For America, the real aim in its latest Vietnam is to stand firm, hang tough in a country where the option is soft, as Mr. Haig would say, and the fodder is plentiful. This is film from Vietnam and El Salvador. Can you tell the difference?
Now that you're talking about going to war again, now that you've got a draft registration brought back, now that you're talking about drawing the line in terms of when does America go to war, for what reasons does it go to war, who carries the burden going to war, you've got to talk about us because we're the last ones that responded.
Missing from this film are the other witnesses to the Vietnam period, the Vietnamese. We hear very little about them these days, and the American veterans speak little about them, perhaps because what was done over there was so terrible that only the victims can afford to speak about it. Such has been the politics of vengeance that the people of Vietnam are now almost completely isolated, with only the waiting arms of the Russians to turn to, whom they rightly distrust as much as they distrusted the Americans, the French, the Japanese, and the Chinese who came to their country selling noble causes. So here is the news from Vietnam. In the wake of the war's devastation, there is now famine. Rations are less than even during the war years, about half the food needed for a healthy survival. There is no milk anymore for children over the age of 1, and unexploded mines and bombs kill children every day. Like its refusal to help its own victims of the war, the American government has denied all help to the people of Vietnam, and so too has the British government. On the other hand, both governments are building the greatest military machine ever, in preparation for a war that may well end all wars. And for that one, heroes need not apply.
We were so psyched up during the training that people were begging to go to Vietnam.
I believe the domino theory for what they, if Vietnam falls, then Laos will fall, and then Cambodia, and, eventually they'll be, hitting the beach out in L.A., but, that's all I knew about Vietnam.
How do you feel about that now?
Oh, it's absurd. That's ridiculous. I don't think anybody believes that anymore.
A lot of people died for it.
They certainly did. Isn't that a shame?
A soldier came down from Dien Bien Phu with silence in his eye. He told of many a night when fire was the sky. Told of many a morning when the bravest of men would cry, knowing that through Satan's earthbound magic many more would have to die.